So I started a new video series called The Buyer's Journey, where I chat with marketers, high-level operators, and founders, all within the B2B SaaS industry, revolving around the modern B2B buyer's journey. So how to stand out when competition is at an all-time high, how startups can remove friction from the buyer's journey, which is now a competitive disadvantage, and then how to efficiently grow rather than this wasteful spending that the entire SaaS industry was built upon over the last decade. So this episode, I'm with Joe Daniels. He helps startups with narrative-led growth. Future episodes are going to be posted on a new YouTube channel, which I've linked in the description. So if you like my content here, please go subscribe to me there. I'm still going to be posting more personal content on this channel, don't worry. But yeah, I'll stop talking now and go to the episode. All right, we're live. So today I'm joined by Joe, the founder at an agency called Spiel. We were just discussing the best way to pronounce that.
You got it right.
So my understanding is you work with early stage startups, helping them, well, not necessarily early stage, but startups, helping them take more market share through narrative-led growth, which is interesting. It's not something I've heard before, and I think we can dig into precisely what that means. But is there anything you'd like to add to that intro, Joe? And also, it'd just be good to get a quick background on yourself.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on. So that was all very accurate, and the pronunciation was spot on, which is good. A bit about me. So yeah, I launched Spiel earlier this year, so it's quite young in its infancy still. Prior to that, I worked at a agency called Treacle, and we did positioning and messaging for other agencies and consultancies, if that makes sense. It's kind of meta in that sense. So like a marketing agency might come to Treacle and be like, oh, there's loads of marketing agencies out there. How do we stand out from the rest of them? And so our job at Treacle was to figure out how to help them do that. And the initial sort of playbook that we had was all based around niching, because that was kind of the advice that everyone would give, right? Is like, pick a niche, go all in on that niche, and you'll win it. And what we found was, I think mostly as a result of the pandemic, that a lot of agencies were like, well, I don't want a niche, because what if I'd niched into, tourism and travel, for example? Well, then we'd be screwed right now. So what happened was that as agency founders became less and less interested in niching, we were like, well, what are some other ways that they can stand out and be different? And one of the things that, me and my boss at the time, Roland, kind of co-created together was this concept of positioning around a narrative. And that narrative for an agency generally was sort of along the lines of, what's your philosophy or approach or point of view? And that seems to work pretty well in the agency world. And when I left Treacle, I was like, my roots were back in SaaS. That was where I sort of first started my career. And I was like, maybe I should go back there armed with this new kind of narrative knowledge and see if it works for SaaS, because, B2B SaaS especially, and agencies are very much the same business model, really. It's just one's done with people, one's done with software. So then I started Spiel, and here I am talking about narrative for B2B SaaS.
Got it. Interesting. So I run an agency. I mean, I'm kind of phasing it out, but I've had an agency over the last 2 years or so. And so I'm very familiar with that space. I'm also very familiar with the SaaS industry, because I've worked in the SaaS industry and I work with SaaS companies. I'm just interested to know, like, what business do you think is harder to make stand out, like agencies or SaaS companies? I'm interested to hear your perspective on that.
Honestly, it's I think that both industries have the same underlying problem, right? Which is that there's a lot of them. There's a lot of competition out there, way more than there's ever been before, because in the agency world, it's now easier than ever to start an agency. I mean, as we both know, it's not easy, but it's the barrier to entry is lower, right? Like, it's it's easier to get started and to sort of set it up and get running with it, and it be a one-man operation and so on. And the barrier to entry for SaaS is also lower now that you've got all the no-code platforms that you can build a product with, AI now coming into the fray as well. Like, it's, again, the barrier to entry to even start building a SaaS product is lower. And what that means is ultimately there's more and more products or agencies that do solve the same problems. And I think even if you niche down now, the problem is that niche is still probably being served by at least 2 or 3 other competitors, or like it's such a, it's kind of what I call like a false niche, where it's like, oh, I've niched into sports brands, but actually that's just because you've decided to do it for sports brands. Like, there's nothing about you that means you should do it for sports brands. Do you see what I mean? It's almost like you've chosen it arbitrarily, and actually then niching isn't an advantage there. Like, if I'm a sports brand, I want to know why I should choose you specifically. And if it's just, oh, well, because I like sports and decided to niche into sports brands, that's not really a valid reason to pick you, right? So in terms of standing out, I think the hard part, I suppose, with agencies is that it's very people-based, right? Like, it is about the people. And so when you start talking about differentiators in terms of your people, it can instantly sound quite fluffy and a bit sort of, not very tangible. And so I think the challenge there is, how do you take what's essentially kind of like a fluffy, personable thing and turn it into like an actual tangible advantage and reason to choose your agency? And then on the flip side of SaaS, it's almost got like the opposite problem, right? Which is that it's very tangible. Often it's very much like, oh, well, these are our product's features and capabilities. This is what it does. But it's like, well, so do all these other products, right? They all have the same functionality. They all have the same features. They're all basically the same product. So then the challenge becomes, how can you almost add that fluffy layer? And obviously it doesn't want to be fluffy, but how do you add that layer of difference to something that's at heart the same? And that's really, for me, where the narrative side came in, which is, if you have a narrative built around your product and a clear sort of point of view on the category that your product sits in, well, that instantly gives you an edge and gives you something to talk about other than, oh, our product does X, Y, and Z. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, yeah. I was just interested to hear that, because my view is that the agency space is super, super, super crowded, because, yeah, I mean, there's really no setup costs. You can get a website for free. In the UK, you can create a company for £15 and it takes 15 minutes. You don't even need a website, to be honest. And it's really just monetizing your skills. Whereas software, you need a product. But again, we are getting to that point where that's also, I wouldn't call it easy, but it's becoming quicker. So I was just interested to hear your thoughts on that. So, sorry, was you going to say something?
It's all right. I think the difference as well, and is what we're seeing, is like, historically, I suppose, with SaaS, there was that barrier to entry of, if, for example, me, I'm not a developer, I can't code. It would be really hard for me to build a product historically. But actually now, if I wanted to, I could probably go and cobble together some kind of, let's say a CRM using no code platforms and stuff, and sort of, after a few weeks, probably kind of have a functioning product, right? And so, sure, it's not going to be the best product in the world because I'm doing it, but like it's that barrier to entry, I think, is lower. And so, yeah, it's not easy, but it's definitely easier than it ever has been. And I assume is only going to get easier as time goes on.
Yeah, for sure. No, I completely agree with that. So I guess, what is narrative-led growth then? Typically, I'm personally, you maybe see through my content and stuff, I like labeling things. I like packaging things because I think it makes them more attractive. It also enables you to develop a narrative around that thing. So I'm interested to hear, in your eyes, what is narrative-led growth? What's the mission behind it? And we can kind of dig into it from there.
Yeah, cool. So I think, I suppose the best way to start is to almost talk about why I think it's needed. And I think it stems from the conversation that we've just had about how it's easier than ever. The barriers to entry are lower for, if we talk about specifically B2B SaaS, for anyone can now kind of cobble together a B2B SaaS product. And generally speaking, I think if you go into any kind of category and any kind of market, there's going to be multiple players in that market. And the past advice for maybe the past 10 years or so has basically all been around the whole, there's a lot of product-led growth movement out there, right? And product-led growth is really good when it comes to that kind of convincing them that your product is good. Do you know what I mean? It's like, oh, I get to try it out, free trial, freemium products, all of those tactics that are taken for granted now, obviously were created around 10 years ago, I think. And what happens is now people assume that means they can just build the product and it will kind of sell itself. And that's, I think, a bit of a trap. I call it the PLG trap that people fall into, which is that actually it only works if you're the only product solving that problem, right? If you're the only CRM in the world, well, great, yeah, just show people what it does and they'll go, oh, I need this. But that's no longer the case. It maybe used to be the case that you could kind of create a one-of-a-kind product, but it's virtually impossible now to do that. Or if you have, you still have to then educate people on, what it is and how and why they even need it, right? So what I figured was, instead of, the sort of common messaging advice and positioning advice and so on right now, which is be very clear and show what your product does, and people will choose it based on that. It's more, well, how can we engage the buyers in a way that isn't selling the product? And the reason for that is buyers don't really trust sales, and that's always probably been the case, but it's getting worse. There seems to be a bigger gap between buyers and sellers than ever, as I'm sure you know. And so instantly, if you're going to pitching your product mode, then the buyers are kind of I've seen this all before. I've seen these. You've got 5 websites selling me on the same functionality. How do I choose? Is the ultimate question. And unless you want to compete on price, which obviously you shouldn't, then you need to compete on something else. And so at the heart of narrative-led growth is this idea of having a narrative and a category point of view, and they're both kind of interchangeable. They're both two sides of the same coin. And essentially the core principle is that you sell people in on that. You sell people in on your point of view. And if they buy into your point of view, then they'll automatically be bought into your product, because your product is how you bring that point of view to life, if that makes sense. So, as an example, if a good example is a company called Comsor. I don't know if you've heard of them. They have this whole go-to-network thing, right? And so, they recently published this whole playbook where it was the sales development rep, it should evolve into a network development rep. They basically put forward their point of view. And actually most of their marketing, if not all, is focused on communicating that narrative and that point of view. And the idea is people either go, no, this is just a load of nonsense, a load of rubbish. I don't like this at all. It's wrong. And therefore would never have been a good customer in the first place for their product. And so it filters out the bad ones who already disagree with you. But also it means that people like myself, for example, will read and engage with this and go, oh, this is really cool. I'm now talking about it on on this podcast, right? And spreading the word almost of their narrative and their point of view. And if I decide, oh, well, actually, I need to really work on my go-to-network stuff, obviously Comstor is going to be the product that I use to do that. It would be weird to engage with all of this and then go, right, who's going to help me with that? Because I already know, right? Comstor are going to help me with that. So I think it's all about owning a place in people's minds, but also in people's hearts, because it's kind of a movement. It's kind of an emotional resonance thing that goes on. And therefore, the product kind of sells itself is really the logic behind it. So, yeah, don't know. I just threw a lot of information at you, I realize.
No, it's good. This is good. And, something I think deeply about a lot. There's loads of resources out there on stuff like this. Like, for example, Eugene Schwartz, kind of OG copywriter slash advertiser, he talks about market sophistication. And so basically in the beginning stages, if you're like the first product to market, you can do what the hell you want because you're the first product, right? It's like, the first fitness coach, right? They owned the market. They could get whoever they wanted. But then, as more competitors enter the market, well, then it's like you need to introduce something new. It's like, okay, well, I'll help you get fitter through my V-up method, right? So they introduce like a new method, and then more competitors enter the market. But at the last stage of sophistication, he talks through that the best way to win is through identifying with your market, being the only thing for them, just really, really identifying with like a small group of people or a specific group of people rather than being this all-in-one solution. You become identified with this movement or whatever. So that's a really good resource on that. Also, Russell Brunson talks about it a lot in his Expert Secrets book as well, about creating a movement. You look at any person of authority, whether it be political, whether it be military, they've basically, if you look at what they've done, is they've essentially created movements, whether it be for good, sometimes it's for bad things, but it's all about having a story and identifying with people, even to the like, to give a real specific example, like in America, the red hat that says MAGA or Make America Great Again, like people identify with that and they become part of a tribe. So like this is all really deeply resonating with me for sure.
No, it's a really good point. And I think, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think the politics parallels are a really interesting thing. We've just had the election over here in England, right? And I think as a marketer, I can't help but kind of almost watch from like a distant point of view as the events unfold and be like, oh, why are they doing that? How have they positioned themselves? How has that party campaigned? And like, it's very much like almost like a marketing hotbed of activity for like a good couple of months here. And I think when you look, this is a very niche thing. So if you're listening to this and you're not in England, it probably means nothing. But like when you look at, say, the Green Party and Reform Party, who are two very small parties over here, I think one of the reasons Reform did really well in terms of the votes, despite being so young, is that they have quite a clear narrative. Like, do I agree with it? No, but like it's objectively a very strong case that they put forward. It's very tangible. It's very much like, vote for us because we believe in this thing. It's very concrete. It's easy for people to understand and go either I align with it or either I don't. Whereas when you look at, the bigger parties like Labour and Conservatives, it's actually kind of hard that they've got so many different things going on that it's hard to say with absolute conviction, oh, this party stands for this. Do you know what I mean? And so I think the rise of parties like Reform and Green, who've also had their best election, is partly because of how people now want to believe in something and stand up and align themselves with something. But it's hard to do that if your message is muddled and you're sort of spanning different narratives at once. Whereas if you are smaller and have one clear narrative, one clear story that you're selling, it's easier for people to buy into it, I think. And so it's a good parallel.
So what there's a few books on this. So something Russell Brunson talks about in his book Expert Secrets is that you want to have, rather than having what he calls an improvement offer, which would be, okay, we're cheaper or we're better, or we have one more feature than our competitors, rather than being an improvement offer, try to create an entirely new opportunity. So I actually reached out to Mac and complimented him on that NDR playbook, because that's what they've done is, they've basically created this entire new opportunity, rather than saying like, oh, our product's a bit better than this product, or we're cheaper, or whatever. They've created like an entirely new opportunity. And that's what people want. People don't want just something marginally better, because there's also at a psychological level to go after an improvement offer. It involves you accepting that you were doing something wrong, and we never like to accept that we're wrong, and so we want an entirely new opportunity. I think there's a book out there, I haven't read it yet, where it's about basically creating a new category rather than competing in an existing competitive market. Just try to create your own, which is obviously what Drift did in like 2015, 16. I could geek out about this stuff, but I'm interested.
No, it's really cool. Yeah,
I'm interested to hear like what are the steps to creating a good narrative? Like, I think it's clear that the problem, we've talked about the solution, which is creating a narrative, but how do you actually create a good one?
Yeah. So it's hard for starters. There's a lot. It's funny because I have like a process and a framework that I work through with clients or attempts to work through with clients. What inevitably happens is it all gets derailed, and it's just kind of this weird conversation, debate, discussion, argument thing that happens, and somehow out of that is birthed this narrative. But I think there are some fundamental kind of building blocks that I suppose you need. How you get to them can obviously vary basically from time to time. But I think, the first thing to realize is a bit of a mindset shift. I think when a lot of people think about storytelling for their business, they make their products the hero. They're like, oh, we're the hero because we've got all these capabilities. Look at us. And it's like, well, no, that shouldn't be the case. The hero should be your buyers, your customers. They're the ones that are on this journey. They're the ones that have this problem. Your job is to essentially be their sidekick, right? So I always make the Luke Skywalker Yoda comparison. Like, they're Luke Skywalker, you're Yoda, sort of sitting on their back going, oh, go that way. And I think the first thing to do is define who that hero is. And the more specific you can get, the stronger generally your narrative will be, because obviously if you're talking to multiple different types of people, it's hard to find that unifying thread that sort of ties them all together. It is possible, but it's a lot harder. So, I mean, a good example of one where it is possible is like Once, which is like a new suite of products launched by the guys at 37 Signals. Their whole thing is essentially anti-SaaS, right? Like, it's like, oh, actually, let's go back to one-off payments where you own it, sort of thing. And it's as if they've invented it when actually, it's old. It's like the old way of doing it. But what they're doing is actually, that's a story, that's a narrative that unifies all kinds of buyers within SaaS, right? Like, if you could take someone from customer success at a small startup and someone from marketing at a massive enterprise company, and actually both might share that view, right? So you can have these kind of macro level narratives, and it can work. It's harder, but you can do it. But it is harder, which is why I generally suggest sort of, not niching per se, but at least narrowing down who that person is that you're talking to, and the type of company they work for, with it being a B2B sort of thing. But I also think don't overcomplicate it. Sometimes you have these personas that go into like immaculate detail about how many kids they've got and like what like they cut their lawn to and stuff like that. And it's like, that doesn't matter, right? Like, it's like, so I think very much just kind of like, who is this person? What company do they work for? And then the big thing is really, what are they trying to achieve that they currently can't achieve or are finding it hard to achieve? And that's kind of building block number one. Building block number two is the villain of the story. And this, again, can take a few different forms depending on where you're at and where your category's at and so on. And so one common type of villain would be like what I call the status quo. So it's like what the villain is essentially the current way of doing things. And you're essentially saying, that doesn't work for X, Y, and Z. And like you said, you have to be careful not to be like, you're doing it wrong. It's more generally, as an industry, we've got this wrong and we've led you down the wrong path. So now let's kind of redirect you down the right path. And It could be something as simple as you're currently using spreadsheets. If we go back to the CRM example, imagining that CRMs didn't exist, it could be like you're currently using a spreadsheet to track all of this data on your potential customers. Well, actually, we've got a CRM that does that all for you automatically. It's like, so the villain there is essentially the old way, which is a spreadsheet, right? So it's kind of fighting against the outdated way of doing it. But you could also pick a fight which is like a direct competitor if you really wanted to do that. Like it's riskier. It tends to work well if you're picking a fight with like a massive competitor, kind of like a David versus Goliath story, because you're probably so small that Goliath's a bit like, it doesn't even matter, right? Like they're going to ignore you. Whereas if you pick someone your size, they might fight back, right? that becomes a bit more brutal. And so a good example of that is Butterdocs, which I'm sure you might have seen. Everyone's talking about Butterdocs at the moment, but they have this whole thing, which is they've picked a fight with Google Docs specifically, and their whole homepage is basically why Google Docs is bad and why Butterdocs is better. So yeah, the villain could be another tool specifically, another company specifically. Or, and this is where the category point of view comes in, it could be like a concept, sort of fighting against a concept that everyone's kind of taken for granted, and you're sort of flipping it around and going, why do we do that? And that's where Comstor comes in as the example, is almost like, well, we've all taken it for granted that salespeople need to just do a load of cold outreach and play the numbers game. And they've gone, well, why is that though? And then so they're challenging that kind of category norm and going, well, what if there's a different way? That for me is generally the strongest play, because that's really what gets the movement going. It's harder to start a movement that's like, oh, we're anti Google Docs, like you can, but like it's harder to get that kind of momentum behind, I suppose. So that's the second building block. The third building block, and this is the important bit, is how your product solves that problem. Because I think it's easy to go down this narrative storytelling route and kind of make it be a bit fluffy and sort of talk about, oh, well, this is our vision, this is our mission, this is the founder's origin story. It's like none of that actually really matters so much. They might be influencing the narrative, but really it's kind of, it needs to call back to your product, because if it doesn't, well, then no one's going to know what your product does for them, right? So like it still has to tie into your product. And I think this is where I call it the superpower, and it's where you've taken that problem, that villain, and you've gone, well, this is how we solve it. This is how our product solves it specifically. And what it means is, instead of just doing a whole feature dump thing, you're focusing on one core capability, one core solution that your product offers. And that kind of then wraps the story up. It's kind of that three-pronged approach. You've got number one is your hero, your customer, and they're trying to achieve something. Number two is why they can't currently achieve it, or they can, but it's a lot more effort, for example, than it should be. And number three is how to overcome that obstacle, that villain, with the help of your sidekick, which is the product. They're the kind of three main building blocks, I would say, if I had to summarize them, of what your narrative should have.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, very tactical, and like completely agree with it. I think especially with the sort of enemy, I call them like common enemies, things that you can throw stones at together, rather than, because you never want to pick apart your target audience because they'll take it personal. But you want to create these common enemies, and it could just be like the old way of doing things, the current workflows they have, the tools, maybe they've just been taught the wrong things. So I think a key part, and I believe you talk about this in your own messaging, are those points of views that you have that sort of link back up to your narrative. So obviously how, you can create your narrative, and you can do these workshops, but you need to bring that narrative to your market, right? You need to communicate it to your market. And I think a key part of that are your points of views. Now, something I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how you can develop those points of views, because I think this is really a challenging part, because I feel like your points of views are a function of your insights on the market, rolling up your sleeves, uncovering those problems, deep insights about your target audience. Really, the clearer you are on those things, the better your points of views are, because if you sort of try to take the shortcut, then your points of views just aren't really going to be unique. They're just going to, kind of blend in with everything else. And so I'm interested to hear your thoughts on like the point of view side of things and how that sort of translates to, say, your website messaging or, your content marketing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're spot on, which is like, I think you have to have a very deep knowledge and understanding of the category you're in, the industry you're in, to be able to have an actually useful point of view on it. I could probably, I don't know, to use, I know as an example, sports marketing again, right? Like I could probably come up with a point of view on sports marketing, but chances are people that have been in that industry for 5 to 10 years would tell me that that's just, everyone knows that. You're just stating the obvious. And I think it's just to go off on a tangent. It's a problem I see with a lot of thought leadership content, which is that a lot of the time it's not really thought leadership. It's just thoughts that other people have had and you're also repeating, right? Which is fine, but it's not leadership. And I think that leadership side is that's where the point of view comes in. It's almost, what are you contributing that's new to this world that maybe some people have said, but not enough that it's common knowledge kind of thing. And it comes for me from being completely immersed in that world. And it's why when I do this work with clients, it has to really come from the founder or co-founders. Generally they are the most knowledgeable about their products because they, invented it in the first place, but also chances are they've lived in this world a lot longer than other people at the company have. Like they were obviously, at the birth of their product. Chances are they created that product because they saw some kind of opportunity, some kind of gap in the market. It's not, it's quite rare for someone to go, oh, that CRM is doing really well, let's make the exact same products. That's like, people do, sure. But like generally speaking, they've gone, oh, that CRM is really good, but if we tweak it a bit, it would work even better for the construction industry. And so they've already kind of started to adopt that point of view. They've just never fully explored it. And so often when I work with clients, it's almost, I call it like founder therapy, where like they kind of have the answers in their head. They kind of know ultimately what that opportunity was that they spotted, therefore what the problem was that wasn't being solved. And that's kind of the building blocks of that point of view. It's kind of like, it's hard to come up with a formula for something like it because it's kind of, abstract, but it's kind of like, what's something that hasn't been solved in this industry that we're solving? That's the kind of heart of the narrative, but also it's the heart of the point of view, which is, well, our point of view is that this is bad and that this thing is good, right? Like it's that kind of, again, that good versus bad sort of dichotomy. And it's, I think, to go back to Mac's example with Comstor, his point of view is that outbound sales isn't very effective because it's cold outreach. You don't know these people, you're talking to strangers. He's then found data to back up that point of view, which is also really important because otherwise it is just your opinion. If you can back it up in some way, that's really useful. And then he's gone, the flip side of that point of view is, we believe firmly that the way forward is with your go-to-network power. And so you can see that in a way that the villain of the narrative is kind of the seed of the point of view, if that makes sense. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, it did. No, this is good. So I had a question there about, that's it. So you mentioned something important there, which is, I think, data. Whenever you're trying to make an argument, which I think, in my opinion, that's what you're trying to do with a narrative. You're trying to change beliefs, or you're trying to influence beliefs, and so therefore you have to make an argument. And I think what makes a solid argument is data. And so when working with these companies, do they sort of, have to go away and do some homework, i.e. qualitative research, speaking with customers and their market, or are they sort of expected to to already bring that to the conversation? Like, how do you ensure that these narratives that you're helping these companies develop are actually built upon data rather than, I guess, opinions or assumptions?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I think you need both, right? Is the key as well. And I think this is again another sort of trap that people fall into, is that they often think if I just throw a load of stats at people, then they'll go, yeah, cool, that makes sense. Or they'll go, well, if we don't use any stats and just tell a story, people will like it. And really, you need both. Like you need the data, but you need the narrative to bring it to life. And I think anyone that works in kind of the data science world would tell you the same. In terms of the more specific question, so I think I don't do much research myself. I will do some. I will, do a lot of like desk research, and I can speak to customers. I do find it's often better to speak to prospects rather than customers, because the customers are often they've almost been biased by the fact that they've bought your product and used your products. Ideally, if you can speak to prospects, that's even better. Generally what I find is the founders all do know it. They just sometimes need the validation of speaking to these people to back it up. But actually, more often than not, they're completely aligned. They do know this stuff. It's just that they've never actually necessarily got it out of their heads and down onto the paper, so to speak. And so, yes, there's some research involved. I think the stats research is almost better. And I think, if you can do that yourself, that puts you in a really strong position. So, if you can do your own research and do your own surveys and so on and gather that data yourself, that's also quite a strong play to be like, well, you can publish it, you can repurpose it in various ways in like a white paper and so on. You can use that as content to sort of prove the narrative that you're taking to market. But also it means that you're in control of how that data is gathered and the questions you ask, and you can, obviously you don't want to influence the answers, but you at least have a better understanding. Ultimately, a better understanding of your customers comes out of that work. So it's definitely worth doing. And there are other people that I can bring in who are experts at that, because I'm not an expert at that. I end up waffling on about stuff with people and never get to the point. So yeah, there are people that come in that do that who are better than me, if they don't want to do it themselves. But there's a lot of research often out there anyway. If it is a crowded market, which generally is where my work helps the most, then actually there's probably a lot of research out there already. If you do some digging and sort of, there's probably some stats and papers and stuff out there already that you can use. But for sure, it's definitely an important part. And I think even if you never publish those stats or use those stats anyway, so like my website, for example, it goes quite stat heavy at the start. Like it's very much, when I introduce the problem, I'm like, look, here's 3 eye-opening stats that you should really read, because that's going to help you understand what I'm talking about. But you don't have to do that, right? You could use the stats internally to be like, to validate your thinking, be like, we are right here, because you need that confidence too. Like it's not just about them believing in it, it's about you believing in it internally as a company and having everyone aligned and on board. And if data is the best way to do it internally but not externally, then that's obviously still useful. Yeah.
No, I like it. Love it. All right. So bringing this to a close, I'm interested to, so obviously you specifically focus on the area of like messaging and narrative, right? But, given the current state we're in the SaaS industry, barrier to entry is lowering to create a software product, which means more competitors are flooding the market. What else do you think startups or even maybe more mature SaaS companies can be doing to really be a bit more buyer-centric and help them stand out in this competitive market? What else do you think they could be doing? Do you have any opinions on that?
I think there's a couple of other, movements, so to speak, other led growth movements that I think align quite nicely with what I do. And I think, a big one, which isn't that new now, is the whole founder-led stuff, which is make your founder, or founders, the figurehead of what you're saying. And so, sure, it's improved if you've got your narrative and point of view, but even if you haven't, even if it's just using your founder to market your products the old-fashioned way, that's still better than the company marketing it. It's still a lot more personable. It's people follow people, not companies. It's like, especially on LinkedIn, you see a LinkedIn page for a company might basically have like a handful of followers, and it's probably the employees, whereas the founder might have tens of thousands. And it's like, well, you may as well use that, right? You may as well use that audience that person's built up. So I think founder-led is definitely a big way to help stand out, because even if you're selling the exact same thing, your founder is a different person. And so, yes, it's a surface level difference. It's not key to the product, but like, it is a difference. It is still something you can lean into, is their personality, if they've got one, which they don't always, I suppose. And then the other one is audience led, which a friend of mine called Rob Carpenter, he's really big on. He'd probably be worth speaking to, actually, if you haven't already. And he was at Butterdocs, funnily enough, and has left to start his own agency. And he's all about co-creating the content and marketing assets with your audience and involving them in the creation of it. So it's a mix of, user-generated content is obviously an example of that, but also, like we just mentioned, with the reports and surveys and, white papers and stuff, bringing them in and having them create stuff. Butterdocs has a big template creation thing going on. So like, you reach out to people and they ask them, oh, I really like this framework you've got. Do you want to make a template for Butterdocs? It just helps people market Butterdocs because, so like I'm doing a template for them, for example. Once it's done, I'll share it. I'll be like, oh, guys, you should check out this on Butterdocs. I've essentially just done marketing for Butterdocs for free. And it's more believable because it comes from someone in an authentic point of view. So I think that audience-led approach plays really nicely as well. And I think both of those are underpinned, in my opinion, by the narrative stuff. But like, even if you don't do the narrative side, it's still a useful sort of strategy and tactic to take forward, I think. So I think both of those,
Interesting. Yeah, that
I think it's
second
about
one is not
putting the
something I
buyers at
personally looked into too much, but I definitely... Oh, sorry, I talked over you there.
No, sorry. Yeah,
bit of disconnection. But the second thing you talked through there, I don't know if there's a technical term for that, maybe co-marketing or customer marketing, but I like that. It's not something I've looked into too much, so I'm definitely going to look into that a bit more. This conversation's been super valuable, learning all about narratives. If people want to learn more about you, if they want to collaborate with you, where do you suggest they go?
Good question. I mean, essentially, I have kind of three things. I've got my website, which kind of gives you the bare bones of what I do. You've probably got spoilers from this episode if you've listened, so you probably don't need to see that as much. Then my LinkedIn is where I'm probably most active. I post on there a lot, probably too much. Spend half my life on LinkedIn now. So that's a good place to reach me. And I do also have a newsletter that where I basically talk about this stuff in as much detail as I want because it's my newsletter. So you can see that there's a link to that on my website, which is Spiel.agency. So yeah, I guess that's the first point of going to.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, Joe. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much.